Welcome to our show right here. Lou, I gotta be honest with you. I gotta tell you, this thing has just really taken off. I mean, the amazing support that we've received, the viewership, the people really resonating and responding to it. I was taken aback, Lou. Did you read some of those comments? I mean, they were really.
I appreciate them all. I also think, yeah, so did the Andromeda strain take off, and look where that got us. To use a movie reference instead of a COVID reference, because I think we're all tired of those.
I will say, that is something we'll have to get into on later episodes of this. Just how impactful some of these, natural disasters or phenomenons or even pandemics have been to the movie business. I think it's an interesting.
Well,
history.
There's Earthquake, with Sensurround, which was this enormous speaker system that they built to simulate the vibrations of an earthquake. I remember going to see it when it first opened at the Grauman's Chinese, the real one, not the movie ride one. And Grauman's Chinese is amazingly decorated inside with all these hanging pendulums and things. And they stretched a cargo net across the ceiling so that just in case, God forbid, something fell down, it wouldn't hit the audience. And I could never find out whether that was a real possibility or just part of selling the effect. But either way, it was pretty powerful. And then they had spent all that money and built all these installations for the theaters and said, well, now what do? We can't do another earthquake movie forever. So I forget the order, but the next one was Midway. So they used it to simulate the sound of the airplanes and the bombs and all of that. And then the last one, I think, was Roller Coaster, which is a great movie, by the way, one we're going to do on the Genre Guys one of these days soon, with George Siegel as kind of the OSHA inspector of the roller coasters that Timothy Bottoms is putting bombs on to get ransom. So, and Richard Widmark is in it too, and Lalo Schifrin did the music, and it's a swell movie. It really is.
Ooh, wow! Some of those disaster films, and as you were mentioning before, there Hollywood has had a love-hate relationship with those films over the years, right? Like Twister is a big phenomenon. Oh, we got to do that, and it's like, okay, well,
you know what? I just bought the discs of. I just saw it advertised and said, "Oh, they're terrible," but I got to get it. Well, not all terrible. It's called Airport: The Terminal Pack. It's all 4 airport disaster movies, and I'd forgotten there were 4. I thought it was only 3. But anyway, that should be amusing one of these days. Meanwhile, back at the ranch.
I
had this tiny little bit of unfinished business from last time that I wanted to share with everybody. Because so many of you responded so positively to my stories about William Castle, the great guy who made horror films and the box office and the movie Matinee, which again is a swell picture with John Goodman that is a takeoff on his life. Well, Castle started in the theater before he ever got into the movies. And to show you what kind of a promoter he was, he produced a play, an off-Broadway play that was actually out on Long Island someplace. And the star of it happened to be a young German actress. Well, this was 1938. And the famous
World War II era German dictator
Olympics were about to happen. And
World War II era German dictator
decided, or his propagandist people did, that they would also have an Olympic arts festival. And they sent invitations to actors and singers and musicians and everybody in the arts, come home to Deutschland and be part of the festival. Whether you were famous or nobody, they didn't really care as long as you were born in Germany. Well, this girl who was starring in the play got the invitation, but she said, are you crazy? Why would I go back there? I'm making a show that might get me seen and get me in a real play here in New York. To heck with it. Castle found out. And what he did was he hired 2 guys in the middle of the night to go paint
World War II German symbol
all over the theater so they could take pictures the next day and advertise the play as starring the girl who said no to
World War II era German dictator.
So that's the kind of guy he was for promotion. There would be another one like him.
I just hope when I put this video up, YouTube doesn't target this channel, but I can't not tell that story.
I never thought about it. They're so sensitive. Anyway.
Yeah, they are, but that's a great story. I got to include it for the show. I mean, there's just no way of getting around it. So I have no reservations for sure right there. That is absolutely. But speaking of reservations and people attempting to reserve a spot on this channel via their questions, see how I did that?
Mr. Segway, I salute you.
Well, I don't want to necessarily say that, but
let's get into the questions.
Have...
As most of you know, I've been participating in a lot of shows on our various channels, and that's all fun, but most of that is current events one way or another. It's either the industry as far as negotiations and strikes, which are still impending, by the way, with the IATSE strike or potential strike. But it's all modern day. But the reason why I'm around is to give it some perspective on the past, because that's not my picture, but I'm older than the guy in that picture. So we thought there are lots of generic but interesting questions on Hollywood and how the business works now and how it worked then and how come we do it this way and how come we don't do it that way. General questions about the industry and the mechanics and what happens on the backlot, in the front office, behind the scenes. And that's what we're asking you for questions about. And the caveat is I will not reveal personal confidences or talk about particular personalities that I've worked with. And other than that, it's pretty open. And if I don't like your question, I won't offend you, but I'll say, no, I think we'll leave that one alone. But beyond that, here they come.
Right. Absolutely. And to submit your own question, by the way, if we didn't go over this already, you can leave it in the comment section below, or you can go ahead and use that email address that you're seeing on screen right now, or T3PO. So the channel name, T3P online at yahoo.com. So T3PO and then NLINE at yahoo.com right there. You can go ahead and deliver that for us, and we'll definitely read your questions for sure. Speaking of questions, here we go. We got the first one right here for you. This is a truncated version of this, but I'll go ahead and read the whole thing right here. From
Rephilosophizer.
Well, you're better at this than I am. Awesome show, guys. I'd love to know more about the evolution of sound technology in movies and integrating music scores. I know some of the early stuff, but it would be interesting to see how it had changed over time.
Well, of course, the very early stuff goes back to silent movies. And obviously, when silent movies came out, they had a piano player or an organist, or in some cases, even a small orchestra in the theater playing music that they felt was appropriate to the film. But what you may not know is they had them on the set too, just to give everybody the mood, because of course there was no question of, oh, that'll interrupt the soundtrack, because there wasn't any. In fact, we talk about the Universal Studios tour. What you may not know is that the original tour was, I think it was for 5 cents, 10 cents. And you got a cold chicken box lunch and a seat in a set of bleachers watching them make movies. That technique, by the way, of playing music on the set to get the actors in the mood was done in a modern way by Sergio Leone, because all of those great Westerns that he made, the spaghetti Westerns and all the other movies in Italy, remember, Italy was a relatively small country. And so they could not really make big money just making films in Italian. So what they did was literally record a scratch track, and you might have an Italian actor and a German actor and a Polish actor and a French actor and an American, each one speaking their lines in their own language, not knowing what the other guys were saying, and then they would redub the movie. So since they were dubbing the whole thing, he would actually have Ennio Morricone, the guy that did the music on his great movies, write the soundtrack first and play it on the set, so that when you see all those dramatic looks back and forth between people, it's because they're kind of miming to the music.
That's great. That is.
But you asked about technology.
Yes.
You have to remember that once we went to sound, you've probably, some of you are young enough to have seen like a 16 millimeter projector in your school or something, and that there's this wiggly, wavy line along the edge of the film that is the soundtrack. But that's not how it was done originally. It was optical, but it literally was recorded by a little needle making that scratchy line. And it was recorded on the lot, but in a central sound recording building in the middle of all the sound stages, and wires went from each one. And you had the microphone guy and the mixer sitting on the stage, but they were feeding into a wire that went all the way back. And the reason was that how you made sound sync up with picture is all those little sprocket holes. and keeping things together so that when you edited, when you cut one, you cut the other one at the same time and they went together. And then they composite printed them onto the film. Later, as we got into stereo tracks and multiple tracks, they tended to put basically a tiny little adhesive strip of magnetic tape basically on the film. And the sound head was obviously not at the same point where the light was coming out of the projector, but it was synced up to be a certain number of inches or millimeters away so that everything worked in sync. And now, well, it's all digital. And that reminds me to explain something I take for granted that everybody understands, but you probably maybe don't. Why do we have that famous slate with the clapperboard with the two sets of diagonal lines? And the reason is sound synchronization. Simply this. At the beginning of the scene, we put that in the frame. It has information written on it in chalk, usually, of the scene number and the show and the director of photography. But mostly it's there to say, when they say rolling and somebody says speed, meaning we're letting all the motors on the cameras and the sound recorders all get up to their correct speed, you yell scene 33, take 12, mark, and you clap those two sticks together. So when you go to the editing room and you've got the sound in your left hand and the audio in your right hand, and you put them in a thing called a synchronizer, which is a set of wheels with the little sprocket holes, and you find the spot with a little microphone pickup where that clap noise is, and you put a big X on that frame, and you find the actual frame using a viewer where the two sticks come together, and that's why they've got those diagonal lines so you can see them easier, and you put an X on that, and you lock those two together, and from that point forward till that take is over, everything is in sync. And that's why we say mark and clap it and then yell action sometime. Now you know.
It is a fascinating thing to see the evolution of sound technology and how that's impacted film. I know that, for example, the going from what is it, the silent film era to the talkies, as they would say, that impacted production greatly. For example, now you have to have sound stages in order to keep the sound isolated.
Yeah, in fact, those of you who are Star Trek fans, the stage at what was Desilu and later became part of the Paramount lot and was originally the Republic lot, where they shot the original series, had originally been a silent movie stage, not a sound stage, and then they insulated and put it together. But what they never did was level the floor. And there are stories about shots on that show where the cameraman walked away from the dolly for a second and it kept rolling, and I mean literally rolling across the floor and down the hill. We put up with these things, but sound stages. And then when you get into audience shows, right, well, with all the lights on, it gets hot in there. And so you had to develop air conditioning that was silent enough that it wasn't recorded on the soundtrack. So, sound is a funny thing. One time I was on the set on Seinfeld, and it was that diner, that they had, that they always were eating at.
Absolutely.
And there was this funny swishy sound going on, and nobody could figure it out. And finally they realized one of the extras in the background was wearing like a nylon tracksuit. And every time he walked or moved his legs, that swish, swish of the nylon fabric was going onto the soundtrack. So, and there's always, if you remember the old Westerns where you had the cattlemen and the sheepmen, that's the camera guys and the sound guys, because they're all fighting over the same territory. The sound guy wants to put that microphone right in the face of the person who's talking to get the best sound.
Of course.
Obviously, it's going to be seen on the camera. And if you look at very, very old movies from the early days of sound, you'll see two people sitting at a table with this enormous bouquet of flowers on a vase in front of them. Why is that there? Because the microphone's hidden in it. And the cameras, which were noisy because they were running film through gears, were put in a whole little rolling around box with the cameraman and the camera guy shooting out through a window. And then later they had these enclosures around the camera that they used to call blimps, because that's what they looked like, to silence that grinding noise of the camera motor going. So sound, and of course, the biggest thing sound did was it got rid of a lot of very famous actors who looked dashing and romantic, but who talked like this when they talked in real life, and people laughed at them. And that was not the reaction they were looking for. And so their careers were over.
That's an interesting thing too, right? And I know for animation, like for the premiere of Steamboat Willie, which obviously was one of the first sound cartoons, they had to animate, the kind of like a metronome on the side in order to keep everything synced right there. They had to perform it live, which was really interesting. And some of those early cartoons, well, they didn't have, recording equipment that you can take out into the field to record these things live. So, in fact, they had to use like musical instruments in order to replicate a lot of the natural sounds of the
But of
real
course,
world.
all of those sound effects tricks were things that were honed over the years in radio. It's because they had to imitate all of that stuff too. I don't know how many people out there remember or know of a guy named Stan Freberg. But Stan Freberg was a hilarious comedian who got his start doing voices for cartoons, and we could talk about him all day. But in the early 50s, after radio had pretty much gone by the boards and everything was on TV, he actually did I think it was 13 weeks, and they're hilarious. You should go find them. They're all on YouTube. Radio show, the Stan Freberg Show. And about the 7th or 8th, I forget which numbers, so I can't tell you at it, but you'll have to go look through them, and you'll have fun listening to all of it. He had a letter, supposedly from somebody in the audience, about my kid is enjoying your show, but he watches television and he has no clue what the heck this radio thing is. Could you explain it to him? Well, Freberg said, yes, we've created a demonstration, and all with sound effects. Here is what he did. He said, okay, bring in the 25 tank trucks and pull them up to the side of Lake Michigan. And you hear trucks rumbling. And he's, all right, put the pipes in and drain the water out. And you hear sloshing of water and splashing. All right, bring in the other tank trucks full of hot chocolate. And you hear them pumping hot chocolate, supposedly, into Lake Michigan. All right, bring in the B-52 bomber with the giant marshmallow. And you hear the plane fly in and you're, the bomb and a splash. And then he turns to the microphone and he says, do that on television. Because it's the theater of your imagination. It's between your ears.
Of course. And as we know, sometimes the theater of your imagination is even more convincing than anything that could be put on celluloid. So
sure.
There you go. I love it. Well, thank you so much there for giving us your question right there. I would say your name, but I would only screw it up. So thank you so much, Lou, for helping me out, at least with that one.
Philosophizer.
Philosophizer. There you go.
So philosophized twice, I guess, and made a list of what was naughty and nice.
Well, there you go. TLJ Screwjob 6397 right there asks, my first question for Lou Wasserman's Ghost is, Script Doctor has talked about, quote, in most cases, not wanting fans to work on products because it will impair their ability to, quote, delete a character they love on the world-class BS High Council podcast. Are there any famous examples where that wasn't the case? In other words, are there any big budget / blockbuster fan films out there?
That's a hard one to answer. And the reason is, first of all, I'm assuming he's meaning, people like fan fiction, people who are not in the biz and not professional, but are writing stories. And did that ever get made into a movie? And is that a problem because they're so in love with the character that they aren't willing to cut things or change things to make the story work? I can understand that concern. But the fact of the matter is, most people doing fan fiction, and I'm not impairing their storytelling ability in the least, but we have some people that regularly give us super chats and things who will offer a plot. And my answer is write it. And if you have the rights to the character, self-publish it, because everybody's scared to death of plagiarism suits. Nobody wants to spend a lot of time and a lot of money on a movie only to have some guy come out of the woodwork, and they do, and you see the stories. Well, I wrote that and sent it to you, and you ignored me, and I want my $1 million because you made a hit out of my idea. So that is why there is a buffer zone called agents. I mean, it's one of the many reasons why there are agents. And the idea is that if you get an agent to submit something, he's at least, or she is at least a filter. And that therefore there's accountability, and you sign some paperwork and say that if they happen simultaneously to be coming up with something more or less the same idea, you're giving up any right you have to sue before they'll even read it. If you happen to know a producer and you walk up to them and, hey, will you read my script? The answer is going to be no. And it isn't that they hate you. It isn't that they think you're an amateur and a pain in the butt. It's that they can't legally really do it safely. As far as the impact on the quality, that's It depends on the script, depends on the idea. Maybe you're right and shouldn't cut that character, and maybe the pros are wrong. I don't know.
I think it's a fair point. I mean, I think what Script Doctor was referring to was like, well, if you have like a genre piece, right? If you have something that obviously has existed in another medium, or maybe it's the same medium, and well, you have fans writing for it or something in some case somewhere.
Yeah. Well,
Are they too close? Are they not? It's all kind of subjective.
Because you also have to remember the legal standing of writers in movies and TV, as opposed, for example, to the theater. When you sign a contract either to sell your script outright or to do a work for hire to be on a staff of people like we hear about in all these contracts, you're giving up all personal rights in return for getting paid. You don't own it, and the reason is a practical one. It's not that they're greedy, but they are, and it's not that they're wanting to screw you, but they probably are. It's that after it's all said and done, there is this physical entity, this reality called a movie or a TV show, and they own it, and they have to own it, not you, so that they can then exploit it in various forms and ways. On the other hand, the contract for the Dramatists Guild, as opposed to the Writers Guild, the Dramatists Guild is the guild for playwrights and composers and lyricists in the live theater, which I've also been associated with in my career. It's a lease. It's not a sales contract. Because think about it. You could have Oklahoma playing in New York and playing in Kansas City and playing in San Diego, and they're all individual productions. And so there's no way that the producers can own it, because the only person who goes with it all the way through and at the end is still there to sell it again to somebody is the writer. So again, for theater, you're leasing your work and you retain ownership and rights. For film and TV, you're selling it, whether it's outright because you wrote something on spec or whether it's on a salary as a work for hire.
I think that's a great point in which to bring up. That is absolutely the case. And look, if you have a fan who happens to be a director, maybe it's like a Christopher Nolan, right? And he gets offered the role to produce a Batman trilogy, and he was already a fan going into it. I mean, you could kind of consider that a fan film that was a blockbuster, but fans getting into it and putting up an independent piece of work that really does well. I mean, it's a few and far between.
Yes,
for
very
sure.
much so.
Thank you so much there, TLJ Screwjob, and thank you for supporting the channel so much, and Pro's channel and TPP and all that. So thank you, Josh Hammond, another great supporter right here. Dumb question, but I'll ask it anyways. How do ratings from a show or movie on cable turn into making money for everyone? And how come that didn't work for streaming when, instead of ratings, it's how many people watch it and how long or how many times they watch a movie or a show on a streaming service? I just don't understand, because to me, cable and streaming is the same thing, but streaming, everything is there ready to go. So,
well, ratings, of course, again, go back to radio before TV and then movies on home stuff. Obviously, your rating of a movie in a theater is how many people paid to buy a ticket. But for commercials, they had to have a sense of how many people were listening, and that's how you value the audience for purposes of selling commercial time. And this company called AC Nielsen started up. And originally, they would send out little questionnaires to groups of people, and they picked them in a rudimentary way in those days, and later with much more sophistication, based on the same kind of things they do with political polling, as far as whether you live in the city or the country and how many kids you've got and what. So they get a sense of how you represent a million people just by how you're watching the TV. Then they started putting these boxes on the TV that literally recorded and sent back to them everything you did and when you changed channels and what you watched. And then there's lots of other measuring techniques. Well, those ratings are important because they set the advertising rates. A show that's highly rated is going to get a lot more per minute because you're selling more eyes and ears watching the message, in theory.
absolutely.
Then we got into home video, of course, and suddenly people were fast forwarding through the commercials if they were still there. And so cable became a different story because cable became about subscriptions. It became about how many people are going to sign up for HBO and Showtime and Netflix and all these things and pay once a month for everything on there. And that was before any of them ever thought of putting commercials on. And in fact, at first, when television began, the movie studios were adamantly against it and created this whole kind of caste system of, well, we make movies. We don't make that scummy television stuff. And we're all against what they called free TV because they thought, well, why would somebody buy a ticket at the Bijou on Saturday night when they can sit home in their living room and eat their own popcorn and watch it at home for nothing? They were right. But one person who went against that grain that we all know and love was Walt Disney, because he wanted to build this thing called Disneyland and he didn't have the money. Well, ABC said to him, listen, if you'll do these two shows for us, the Mickey Mouse Club and the Disneyland show, we'll give you $17 million to build Disneyland. And Walt said, where do I sign, basically? Because what he understood was that the Disneyland show, which is the original show that became The Wonderful World of Disney and The Wonderful World of Color and all those other wonderful worlds, it was a commercial for the park. All during the year leading up to the opening, every time they'd go to, and now here's a construction update from Disneyland, and there'd be Walt out there wrestling with the automatic hippos and trying to show you what's going to happen at this ride and how this is going to work. And people were fascinated, and what it did was make what might have been seen as a local LA Orange County attraction into something every kid in America said, I want to go, Mom and Dad, I want to go. Just like we're all now drooling over Epic Universe. Well, then we got into cable. And as I said, that became subscriptions. And whether you watched it a little or a lot, it didn't really matter that much, except if you got so fed up, you said, I don't watch that anymore, I'll drop it, which didn't happen that much. And we got into home cable services putting together these bundles. And you paid $50 a month or whatever it was, and $7 of that went to ESPN, whether you watched it or not, and $4 of it went to Showtime if you added that to your bundle, and all of that was parceled out amongst those channels. Well, They had to know how many people were getting paid as far as the ratings was the total number of subscribers to a given package. But now with streaming, that doesn't happen. And so they had to find another way, because now it's come full circle, and what was called free TV versus pay TV, which the studios were in favor of pay TV because, hey, we're selling them the stuff and getting paid. And their attraction was no commercials. Well, what's happening now? We're getting commercials on streaming all over the place. And so they're getting the membership revenue, or in some cases, Tubi and the rest that are free. Either way, we're getting advertising revenue. And how all that works out, we'll only know. But one concession to reality that they've made is that in the old days, if you turned on the show, you got credited for watching that full half hour or hour show. Now they have these things called views, which they compute with all kinds of formulas about if we watched it for 5 minutes, that's a view. And so we got 1.7 million views for the premiere. Of course, it was 1.7 million people watching for 10 minutes and turning it off, who are never going to come back, who are so upset that they're canceling their subscription if it's Disney Plus. But it's a way of doing things. And the more they go into advertising, the less that'll matter. But what it does mean is that nowadays, when Disney's making these expensive shows for Disney Plus and not getting more subscribers out of it, remember their idea was, well, we've been selling these shows of ours, our classic stuff, and our new stuff to Netflix and to Amazon, and we've been making big money. But if people like our stuff, if we're the only place they can get it, they'll pay us directly instead of them, and we'll clean up, assuming anybody wants to watch the shows. And so they spent a lot of money on a lot of shows that were not very good for reasons we could talk about all day. And people said, I don't think I need this that bad.
And there's actually a great Forbes article written by Caroline Reed, who goes into how Disney spent a whole lot of money to try to get those eyeballs on their Disney Plus program, and how successful or unsuccessful that has been over the years. Very interesting read for sure. And
then there's the question of, well, are we going to release it in the theaters first or not? Mm-hmm. Or like they did recently, put it in the theaters later, trying to,
Right.
The answer is nobody knows. The answer is they all think they know, but so far they're all taking shots in the dark and seeing what'll stick, if I can mix that metaphor.
I think that's the distinction, right, between views and minutes watched, because like you said, Lou, views very different from minutes watched, and I think that's why that minutes watched metric
it's
has
the reason why the old paradigms that we all still use don't really apply. And the same thing is true, as I've said a few times on our shows, about box office. But there's that box office again. It's one thing to say, well, this show made $150 million. And that used to be the merit mark of how much did it make its first week, its second week. Is it going up? Is it going down? The question is, if it made 150 million, which sounds like a lot of money, I'll take it tomorrow if you want to buy something from me. If it cost me $700 million to make it, I'm a loser. It's how'd you come out. It's not how'd you do. So we have to change our measurement perspective that way, because the only thing that counts is, do I get more money back than I put into it so that I can afford to make more?
Right.
And remember that all of this money is borrowed. It's not they've got 800 million sitting in the bank and we'll spend 200 here and 400 there. They have ongoing lines of credit with various banking institutions that they're paying into and taking out of and paying into and taking out of. And if the movie has to do reshoots and has to take longer and has to cost more, and therefore isn't out there earning its keep to pay back the loan and get into profit sooner instead of later, that makes a big difference too.
Absolutely, 100% agree right there, and it's why this Disney Plus venture is. You have a lot of financial institutions looking at it and going, "We're going to make some money off this, right? We're going to make some money off of this. This is a lot of money to spend on all this product." Where
the only measurement is subscriptions. That's the only return. It's not like a TV show. For example, some of the hottest things on Netflix now are shows like Suits and NCIS that were made 5, 10, 15 years ago and are recycling, or The Simpsons or whatever. And that's kind of free. That's kind of free. In the old days, you made the show for NBC, CBS, ABC, the CW, somebody. And whatever it was they were paying you per episode to show that show and therefore be able to sell ads on it, it wasn't as much as you spent. And you might say, well, wait a minute, that's the same thing you're talking about now. No, the difference was you were betting on the fact that it would last long enough that when you sold it into what was called syndication on Channel 9 and Channel 13 and all those, it would make back big money. That didn't always happen. Sometimes it did, but the whole paradigm has shifted from that now. Absolutely,
100%. And it's just such a fascinating thing that we're seeing, with the proliferation of mobile devices and stuff. That's obviously changed viewing habits tremendously. That's why that minutes watched is right there. Lou, I wanted to go ahead and ask you about this. Actually, we saw that strike or the Hollywood strikes that just happened last summer right there, and they were very contentious, and there were a lot of issues at stake right there. One of the big issues then was transparency over these numbers. These streaming services have these numbers, but we don't necessarily get access to them unless they tout them themselves. Do you think something needs to change there for this paradigm to shift maybe even further towards?
Yeah, but it won't be the writers and the directors and the actors that'll make it happen. It'll be the advertisers. Because the advertisers are not going to buy a pig in a poke and say, well, you told me it's reaching this many people. When I was doing TV series with a new show, you'd watch to see who's advertising on it. And if it was relatively small or relatively niche, you said, well, they're getting a taste for it. But if it got to the 13th show or the 17th show or whatever, and suddenly you turned it on and the advertiser was Coca-Cola or Minute Maid Orange Juice or Ford or whatever, now you'd arrive because the big guys were willing to back it. That whole world has been topsy-turvy, upside down, but nobody is going to pay to not know how many people they're reaching. And the problem, I've always described it, if you remember the days when there were great newsstands, the kind that took up a half a block and had it, and you'd go there and there was a million different magazines that you'd never heard of, but they were specializing in some particular thing. Car and Driver, Road and Track, antique railroading, gardening things that are specifically not just gardening, but if you grow begonias, you want this magazine, but if you grow roses, you want that one. It was a multi-universe of very, very specialized things. Well, if you make a particular plant food for roses, you know where you want to advertise, in Rose Magazine, not in Begonia Magazine. If you make Coca-Cola, well, they may be growing plants, but they're having a cold drink afterwards. That's easy. So the very big advertisers were okay, and the very, very small advertisers could be very specialized and targeted. But everybody in between, it was kind of a crapshoot. The funniest representation of this I've ever seen, if you've ever seen the movie Gremlins 2, in which there's kind of a faux Ted Turner character who has umpteen TV networks. And Phoebe Cates is, who's the girl in the movie, whose father was a very famous director and a good friend of mine and president of our Directors Guild. She's giving a tour of the studio, and she's got the little uniform and the little hat. And she's walking by this hallway of big, tall, what we call in the business, elephant doors, the giant doors that lead to stages. And as she walks past one without saying a word, it's strictly a sight gag, but it killed me the first time I saw it, and it still does. Watch for it if you watch Gremlins 2. This door, which is open, and out come two guys in full Robin Hood regalia with the tights and the hat and the bow and arrow. And as they come out and they pat each other on the back and wave and go their separate ways, and they close the door. And the sign on the stage says, "The Archery Channel, all archery, 24/7, 365. That's how specific all of this stuff got. And it worked for a while. And then we had websites and podcasts, and that's YouTube now. That's YouTube. You can find anything you want and a lot of stuff you don't want, and you can choose.
And that's also revolutionized advertising, because now you have targeted advertising using a lot of consumer data, by the way.
Although, it's always reassuring to me if you get paranoid about the bots taking over and Skynet ruling the universe, the stuff I get advertisement for that I'm going, you thought I was interested in that? Boy, are you out of whack. What's wrong with your algorithm? So that's always pleasing when you see how far they can fall down.
Right. Also, Josh, when you look at the ratings from these big reports here, remember to look at the demographics as well, because those demographics also go into a lot of those decisions and are very important for those metrics. So
and
thank you
so
now,
much, Josh. Because of politics, you can't ask certain questions about demographics. You can't answer certain questions because you're reinforcing somebody's supremacy or somebody's inferiority complex or whatever it happens to be. And that's a no-no, right?
I do agree. Josh, thank you so much for your question right there, for sure. And hopefully we provided you a good enough answer, which I think we did. And some amazing stuff from Lou, as always. Next one is from John here. Was it worse that the, quote, old model of studios using willing media to portray actors in a way that hid their actual behavior / lifestyles, which we found out much later after they died? Or is it now, in the age of social media, where actors have access to expose who they really are and have studios paying willing media for fawning coverage of the actor and his or her projects? I feel like the usual answer is that the old Hollywood way of doing things was better, but is it really better than today's because we bought the lie or myth? This is a very interesting one.
It is, but in a certain way, it's exactly the same. Whether I'm paying the New York Times to cover my actress's weekend in New York away from the studio back in Culver City and show her in the latest gowns from the designer of the movie she's about to open in, or whether I'm paying so-called influencers to tell you how wonderfully marvelous a reworked channel of Muddy Water is going to be when it opens, what's the difference? As far as the exposure to scandal, we're all, everybody's a journalist. Everybody's got a camera in their pocket now with their telephone, and everybody might be somewhere and see somebody doing something that they never would have seen or heard otherwise, and certainly wouldn't have been able to back up. And then when they try and back it up with, hey, here's video I saw of Star X getting in this limo with not his wife, Well, did they, or did they make it in AI and re-edit it? So I think we were talking this week when we did the regular show about, I think it's a good thing that people are more skeptical. I think it's happened in consumer products where we have insisted on putting ingredients on products we never asked about before. And you should be skeptical, but you shouldn't be to the point of paranoia. As far as the old model, well, somebody asked me, well, what would have happened if this was, the answer is they would have paid somebody off and made it go away. And that was easier to do in Hollywood because the police chief got invited to the studio for lunch with Mr. Mayor or Mr. Wasserman or whatever. In fact, I could tell stories on Lou all day long. He did some interesting stuff like that. But, well, it's a very long story. But,
Okay.
and I tell enough of those as it is. But the answer is, in some ways, it seems it's changed. In core actual reality, I don't think it has at all. I really don't.
Well, that's interesting because from what I understand, morality clauses used to play a bigger role in some of these contracts for actors who obviously it was multi-picture deals and so forth than they do now. What would you?
Well, the question is, if Hollywood is a dream factory, and if the movies are fantasies, all of them, and if somebody is famous for playing a sweet virginal gal next door, and it turns out that she's out sleeping with 10 guys at a time in some south of the border nightclub on her days off, it's not about whether she's moral. It's about whether she's killing her value to the studio as a commodity. So in that sense, it's protecting not morality as an abstract, but a particular image and a product that they're selling.
Right.
So you always have to understand the difference between those two things. Most of those clauses were real and strict, but well, the genre guys just did Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, starring at the time the most famous scandalous couple in the history of the universe, Liz and Dick, who got famous on Cleopatra for having a very open love affair over in Italy with people who were not their spouses that they were married to at the time. And everybody, oh, that's terrible. But on the same token, ooh, that's kind of terrible, isn't it? Now, when it came time to do this movie, and this movie is full of some pretty tough language for the day, you had a different problem, which was that it violated some of what was then like the rating system, although it wasn't like it is now. In fact, this led to that rating system, the newer one, being made. And particularly, it was an issue with what was called the Catholic League of Decency, who could not only say, well, we think this movie is scandalous and immoral and you shouldn't go see it. They could say, if you do, you're damned to hell. And there was an old phrase, banned in Boston. Well, Boston was their heartbeat because it was kind of the major Irish Catholic diocese in America. So they had to find ways to placate those people because no matter whether you spend a little or a lot on a feature, you want it to open everywhere in the country all at once. And if it's banned in 3 or 4 big places, it's not worth the money. In fact, the story that we told on the show was that when they put together the first cut of the picture and brought in all the studio execs to see it without music and without effects, and just to try and get ready for how to market it, one of the executives was heard to say, oh my God, we just got a $9 million dirty picture on our hands. So, and it's rough, but it's got no nudity and it's got no real sexual content of any kind, and not really. But standards change.
Fascinating. It's just I learn so much, Lou. Every single time we do one of these shows, it truly awesome to have you be doing this on a regular basis now and to be sharing these amazing stories with the rest of us. If I could, Lou, could I tease the viewers on a question that I have maybe for the next show?
Or we can answer it now. It's up to you.
Well, no. I think a tease would be most appropriate because I really want to get into this because I think this is fascinating. Is Hollywood really just an outgrowth of the mob from Chicago?
No. Vegas was for a long time, but not Hollywood. No.
Oh,
No,
there wasn't a little bit of influence in Hollywood.
a little, yeah. But that's because they ran a lot of the businesses that entertainment encompasses. This guy whose face I get to use posthumously, remember that he started out, as did his agency, as a band booker for nightclubs. And the mob owned most of the big nightclubs. So he had to know them and be friends with them to make the deals for his clients to play in those nightclubs. But the movie business, was it connected? No. Was it controlled? No. Did it have friends in low places as well as high? Sure. Did some of the actors and performers have close buddies that were, because they were from neighborhoods where those people ran everything? Yeah, sure you did, Mr. Sinatra. But that doesn't mean that all that stuff about the horse's head in the bed got him the part either. It's just everybody, this country has had a love-hate affair with the mafia. By the way, one of the major things that Coppola and Puzo had to get over to make The Godfather was that no mafia movie had ever made money. They were an absolute negative on the market. Little cheapies maybe, but they didn't do business, and the studio didn't want to put certainly a big budget into something that wasn't liable to do business. But they solved that by making it not really about a mafia movie. It's about a family and about family dynamics within that particular context. So, but the Vegas is another story, but that grew out of, again, the nightclub business. And of course, we all know about Bugsy Siegel and the Flamingo and all of those stories. And of course, the fact that a lot of those buildings were paid for by Teamster pension funds that were controlled by the mafia too. And also, that's a cash business. And anytime you're taking in major big cash and it goes in that room to be counted, if you count two and put one on the side and count two and put one on the side and put that in a briefcase and have No Neck take it back to Kansas City to give it to the boss, well, that's what you do. So these things happen.
Well, then, if we can't tease him on that, then maybe we can tease him on maybe why Hollywood was established in the first place, coming out of that area of the country, around the East Coast, Chicago area.
Well, it really came out of New York and New Jersey, but that's an interesting story. Do you want me to tell it or not? Or do you want to tease it for next time? Why is Hollywood in Hollywood? Has all to do with one famous man that you all think, because of the movie made about him starring Spencer Tracy, was a genius and a benevolent and a wonderful and a loving guy. But if you did what he didn't want you to do, he would hire goons to break you and your camera in a million pieces. And they were running away from him when they wound up in Hollywood.
Interesting. Fascinating. Well,
who is it? What happened? We'll talk about it next time. How's that?
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much, Lou, for joining us. And remember, everybody, yes, you can throw your questions in the comments, but when we get more comments, I don't know, it's gonna be harder to sift through those. So if you want to ensure that you get your question asked on this show right here, go ahead and follow the link right up there on the screen right there. That's T3POnline@yahoo.com. Lou, thank you so much for doing this with me here, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you. Bye.
That's a print. Put it in the can, as we say.
Please comment, like, and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to That Park Place Podcasts Online, your source for exclusive content and highlights from WDW Pro, The Pro Show, and That Park Place, for all the news that should be fun.